The story of the Kissing Tribe. When I was 20, I was a very angry young man. Wherever I looked, I saw corruption, pollution, hypocrisy all around me, and all I wanted to do was leave it all behind. So I hit the road. Now, after 6 weeks or so, I found myself in the foothills of northern Pakistan, and I headed out to the very last village on the map. Then I filled a rucksack with some rice, some dried fruit, a good sleeping bag, until, leaving the broken, sick world of humanity behind me, I set off into nature, into the wild. And with each step I took through forests and mountains, the better I felt. Now I drank freezing cold water from mountain streams, even gathered a few berries as I went along, and just began to really find peace again inside myself. Until on the fourth day, I was walking along through the forest path when all at once I realized I wasn't alone. I turned around and saw the most dazzling woman I've ever seen. She was barefoot, wearing a leather skirt, and her hair trailed down to her waist with flowers threaded inside it. But it was her eyes that blew me away. They were like a deer. Something wild, something untouched, blazed within. And she stared at me, and I stared at her, both of us too petrified to move. Until suddenly, she broke the standoff by leaping forwards with a surprising agility, ran right up to my feet, grabbed my head in her hands, and kissed me like I've never been kissed before. But there was nothing erotic about the kiss. Rather, it was as though she was trying to tell me something. And then, with a final lick of my lips, she ran back up the slope. But after 50 meters or so, she turned around and saw with surprise that I wasn't following her. In fact, I was rooted to the spot in utter shock. And then she made a kind of awkward movement with her hand that I should follow her. So I did. I didn't know what else to do. I ran up the slope after her, and I tried starting a conversation and calling out, but she paid me no mind at all. We ran up through the forest on the barest of paths, and it was all I could do to keep up with her, actually. Until as the hours passed by, and the sun began to sink behind the mountains, and I wondered where we were going to sleep that night, and the air was growing chilly, when suddenly we came to the very top of the pass, and there, in a valley below us, was a village. 30 or 40 mud huts or so, thatched with straw, glowing in the very last of the evening sun. Now the girl ran down a slope to meet all the villagers who were pouring out of their huts to see what was going on, and they formed a circle. And she ran up to the first person in the circle, an old woman, and kissed her for a full 15 seconds. And the old woman turned around to a young boy behind her and kissed him in the same way. And so the kiss passed around the circle like a wave, seeming to change in duration and nature as it went, until they came to some kind of conclusion. And the girl ran off into the back of the village and returned with an old man. He was leaning on a stick, and his eyesight must have been failing because they had to point me out up on the slope. And then he called to me in a broken Urdu, a crackling, hoarse voice, that I should come down and join them. Well, I walked down the slope as if in a dream, and I was taken into one of these mud huts and sat down on a straw mat, and tea was brought. Now the man looked into my eyes and began to tell me the story of this village. He said, once upon a time, this village had been like any other, full of bitterness and grudges, people falling out, not getting along, envy, distrust everywhere, and they couldn't understand why, and they lived in a natural paradise, but somehow they just couldn't get along. So they went to the village shaman to ask him what could they possibly do. Why was it like this? So the shaman agreed to help. And he walked up the highest mountain in the area and sat there for 3 days without any food, drinking only the water of the snow that he could melt in his hands. And as the winds whipped around him, finally the spirits appeared to tell him the answer. The shaman returned to the village, a good deal thinner, his eyes trembling with revelation, and he announced it was the air that was to blame. That what one person said was never quite what somebody else heard. The words themselves got changed and distorted as they travelled through the air. And the answer, the shaman said, was that for 1 day of every week, nobody should say a word. Instead, they would have to communicate everything through a kiss. Now this worked so well that the second year they increased it to 2 days a week, and then the third year to 3 days a week, until after 7 years there was never any need to ever say another word again. Now I was trying to really grasp what the old man was trying to tell me. My Urdu wasn't so good and it was a lot to take in, when suddenly he leant forwards, grabbed my head and told me the story again. Through a kiss. Now, he had no teeth left, and it seemed like he'd been sucking on some raw onions recently. But still, somehow I felt that the story sank in on a deeper level than before. Well, I stayed with them there, with the kissing tribe in that valley for a good 2 months, learning their ways. I remember when a newborn baby came into the village, and everyone would gather around to give it its first welcoming kiss into the world. And similarly, when an old person was dying, everybody would also line up to give them their farewell kiss to take into the life to come. But as much as I was learning with them there, and as much as their ways amazed me, still I knew it wasn't my place. The first snow began to fall, and I was shivering to the bone all the time. And finally I guessed it was time to hit the road again. But though I wanted to sneak off quietly, as I walked out of my hut with my rucksack, the entire village was there gathered. They'd felt it in my kisses of late, after all. Well, it took me an hour to get out of there. But when I finally did, and I walked back up the mountain, back towards the broken, sick world I'd left behind, to see if I could do my bit in healing it, if only through a kiss.